Welcome again to our podcast. So what do we want to talk about tonight?
Well,
Tyler?
I think last time we talked about rest and how the end of purpose of creation, because of how God purposed things, was that humans would have rest. Is that right, Dr.
Yes, that sounds right.
And then today I think we're going to talk about life.
Yeah.
You want to talk about life?
Life is a good subject. I think, I was with my 6-year-old grandson for most of today and yesterday, and he is so full of life. He's running everywhere and doing lots and lots of things. And I think of that. When I think of that, I also think of the way in which God created the world with life. And it's one of the things we want to look at. We want to look here at Genesis 1 and see how everything was set up for that life to come out, forward. And then we want to look at what that means in terms of God setting in place life to go forward right up to the present. And then a little bit of reflection on what that means for our lives and for life today and the life of the Spirit.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah. I think the best way to start is just to look at Genesis 1 and have the Bible right here. Let's read from it and let's see. Why don't you read, if you look at Genesis 1, what you have here is you have God creating light and separating light from darkness, and that's kind of the first day. Mm-hmm. And then God says, let there be a vault between the waters and separate the water above from the water below. And so God makes the vault, and he calls that vault, always taken from the perspective of people on earth looking at it, calls that sky. And the waters beneath are kind of all muddy and mixed together. And then on the third day, he separates those out into dry ground. So you've got the waters, you've got the sky, you've got the dry ground. And what these are, it's not just an observation about some random collection of things that are around, but rather these are the domains in which God will now fill them with life. And for him, the first thing he does is put in on that third day some plants so that there's food. And they're understood as kind of giving the food for the living creatures, and it is creatures, that are going to occupy and fill this world. And so that then leads to day 1, day 2, day 3 are kind of the background for creating those domains, those places, that context in which life can come. And these days 4, 5, and 6 are, let's put some life there. First of all, with the sun and moon and stars kind of giving a backdrop, a background for marking times and days and seasons. The year, as from the perspective on Earth, the sun goes around the whole of the year, but of course from the standpoint of the sun, the Earth goes around the sun during that year. And then the day, as we have daytime and nighttime, the months as the cycle of the moon goes around. All of these are set in place. And so this, along with the plants, along with all of the sky, the waters, and the dry ground, set the scene. And I think then we can start on let's start on verse 20. And Tyler, why don't you read for us verses 20 through 25?
Sure.
Yeah, right there. Genesis 1.
And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which the water teems, and that moves about in it, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas. And let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the 5th day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along on the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so.
Yeah. So what's going on here?
It seems to me that God is just creating things in according to its kind. What does that mean, according to its kind?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question too. But what goes where? I mean.
Well, the birds go in the air.
Yeah.
The sea creatures go in the sea.
Yeah.
And let's see. Yeah, that sounds about right. The living creatures, according to their kind, move along the ground.
Yes. Some living creatures, it kind of divides into a couple of groups there. But you've got the birds with their wings flying. You've got the fish with their fins swimming. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what's interesting, by the way, about this is that when you get a little bit farther along in the scriptures as they talk about clean and unclean animals and things like this, one of the divisions between clean and unclean animals that seems to be pretty clear is that the clean animals are the ones that move about in the domain that they're created to move about. So, for example, the birds with wings that fly, they're clean. Whereas birds with wings that don't fly, like the ostrich, that's unclean. And the fish with fins and scales that swim, they're clean. But those pesky fish type creatures in the water, not fish, but water creatures that don't have that, scales and so forth, they're unclean. The ones that go back and forth between the water and the dry ground, salamanders and others, they're unclean. And again, on the earth, certain kinds of creatures with hooves and legs that can move about on the earth, just the way you think of locomotion, of movement that's appropriate to the land, they're clean. And so there is this sort of expectation that these domains are set by God, and the life in particular, the life of what might be called clean is there. And we could go into this more, but for now I just want to set that up. And then you asked that interesting question about according to its kind. The word for kind there is in Hebrew mean, not being mean, but it is. That's exactly what it sounds like. And in modern Israeli Hebrew, it's the word for species. So it's when you read that, one way of reading it, which people have done, is that each life reproduces after its own kind. So hippopotami don't have giraffes, as children, and that sort of thing. There's a point to that, but if you could give me the scriptures for a minute, I'd like to pull another, the same phrase as used in another passage, actually in Ezekiel. Ezekiel, by the way, talks about life in the world to come. And in chapter 37, it talks about a great river that will flow out of the New Jerusalem, out of the temple, and this river will, contrary to all expectations, get deeper and broader as it goes along. And it will be filled with all kinds of life, go down to what is today called the Dead Sea, where nothing lives, and it will fill it with living water, so there will be life everywhere. And so it's a very exciting picture of life. And and in chapter, where is that described? In Ezekiel chapter 47, and it talks there about all of these creatures and all of what this is going to look like in the river, swarms of living creatures. And there it says in verse 10, fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. That term of many kinds is identical in Hebrew to according to its kind in Genesis. So rather than saying each one will reproduce after its own kind, which I believe was sort of assumed, but the emphasis isn't on that. The emphasis is on the diversity. In other words, it's saying, and the birds will be reproduced in all their various kinds, and the fish in all their kinds, and the animals on the land in all their kinds. So you will have great, great diversity. And this is what God loves as he creates it. Now, if you see that and you realize that everything that God created in the earth, sky, and seas was to be filled with life. And as it was filled with that life, because God values that life, so all of the first 3 days are background to the creating of life. And then he fills it with life in all its diversity. And what does he say to that life? What is it to do? Do you
Multiply.
remember? Multiply, reproduce, fill the earth. It's not just that he created, well, here you can have a couple rats, you can have a couple of mice, and you can have a couple deer, maybe. But rather, no, fill the world with that life. That life would be everywhere. That so does God value life, that he fills the world with it. And it is abundant. Now, I know that there may be a lot of questions about this later on, but you have to understand that from the beginning, this is the value that's set in place. There is value certainly to human life, and we will look at that, God willing. But today, I want to really emphasize on the value that is given to all of life, to the plants and their context, to the animals and theirs. And there are these odd scripture texts in Deuteronomy and elsewhere that say, you know, you can go and defend yourselves and even attack other cities, but when you do not cut down the fruit trees. Allow those fruit trees to continue to flourish. And we know that other armies of the ancient times did cut down fruit trees, the kind of scorched earth policy that's talked about sometimes today. But when they did that, they were violating the will of God, because whatever may be involved in battle or warfare, it was not to destroy the world that God had created, and it was not to destroy the plants and the richness of the flora and fauna that he had given. And again, they'll talk about, you may, for example, you may come across a nest or something like that, and you may need to eat, and you may take the young or the eggs, but you are not to take the mother bird with the young, because that is to provide for there to be ongoing life, that there would be reproduction of life. And in an amazing way, we have actually ancient, particularly Assyrian army scenes of battle and of tribute being brought in which the mother bird and the young are brought. And so this is a blatant disregard. And there are many examples of that today. We are not called upon to just simply destroy the world in our greedy acquisition to get everything we can. We are called upon to respect it and to preserve it. And that's what we were talking also about last week with the sabbatical years and letting the land lie fallow so that it could naturally replenish itself. All of this is going on in this picture because this is what God values. And ultimately, he will place the human species here, the people. And as he does, he will place them not in a world that's barren of life, but in a world that's full and rich and teeming with life, so that we could continue to participate in that life. God is a God of life. He is a God of the living. And that is why he has authored and given this life. And it's another aspect of this that yes.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
I would love to recap a couple things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So first, you were talking about how there was this crossover species. So there was a species that could go from water to land.
Yes.
And that would be unclean.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you'd have things that were just in the air, or just on the land, or just in the water, and those things are clean.
Many of them are, yeah. Yeah, that's
one of the first questions that came up for me is, what is the significance of that cleanliness or the uncleanness?
Yeah, and I don't claim to know everything about it, but I do know that God is a God of order.
Yeah.
And when he created things in a certain orderly fashion.
Right.
And Genesis 1 is intended as a reflection of that. And please understand that we use these terms clean and unclean. It sounds like unclean, well, that's pretty bad. But for Israel, Israel was commanded to take care of the land and of the animal life around it. And so when it was declared unclean, they weren't to touch it. But you see, what that does is that saves all those species. Mm-hmm. So they're preserved alive. Mm. So it has a kind of twofold emphasis. On the one hand, yes, it's unclean. It isn't following the way in which God set things up exactly. But on the other hand, these are many multitudes of species and of animals that God has intended to preserve and to give life to in that way. Now, certainly he did allow for Israel and for the people of God to have animals that could be killed and eaten, or animals that could be put to service, like oxen that could help with the plowing and with the production of agricultural life. All of this was there, but he made special provision for them as well. So you were not to muzzle the ox, you were to feed and give grain to the ox, even though that grain would be grain that you and your family might use as well. But it wasn't that you were to starve your animals. There's a whole abundant scenario and picture here of life and of its abundance and of God's care for it, both the clean and the unclean. These are categories because God wished to place into the world a certain orderliness that, even though in the diversity that would be celebrated, or even especially with the diversity that would be celebrated, that life would be preserved and enhanced.
Well, so fascinating. So there'll probably be more to talk about in terms of clean and unclean. But we at least know that it's still in animals that God cares about, God wants to multiply.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that you talk about diversity and how in the beginning it's according to its kind, and later it'll be like a multitude. It sounds like to me that there'll be an increased diversity of animals as they mate.
Well, I think that's already here. Even in Genesis 1, it's talking about that let them increase in numbers and kind and flourish, and that there would be creatures of the sea that would teem, be fruitful and increase in number, and that every winged bird instead of reading according to its kind, you can read there in all its diversity, in all its various kinds. So God creates them from the beginning. This picture is that God has created these things from the beginning. It's interesting, the word for bird, the word for fish, and the word for people, all of those words are singular in the Genesis 1, not because there's only one created, that'd be strange, but rather because God, when he was created, it's an intentional collective to describe the whole of the scene that was created. So, in a sense, what God's saying here, it's not just so many zillion years ago God created, but this is every bird, this is every fish, this is every living animal, right up to the present that God has created. And that then brings me kind of to another point that I wanted to make, which is that when he created these things in all their diversity, he created the plants. If you go back to the plants, there's this odd kind of description. He said, let this land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds, and all their various kinds. And it was so, and then it just repeats that. Now, why does it go into why does it say, and God said, let there be plants, and there were plants, let there be trees, and there were trees. Why is it all this seed-bearing stuff and everything with its seed in it? Because what God wished to show, and present, and what the writers of Genesis wished to teach, is that plants, animals, people, all have the capacity for reproduction programmed within us from the beginning. You see, in the ancient world, people were desperate because many lived on a level of subsistence. We say from paycheck to paycheck. They would say from meal to meal. And so where was the next food coming from? And there was a great temptation to take the forces of fertility, personify them as deities, as gods and goddesses, and worship them. And what this is teaching is that from the very beginning, it is God who put this in place. And there's no need to worship, and in fact, you're not going to accomplish anything by naming or creating gods of fertility that would provide reproduction. No, that's already within the animals, people, plants that God has created from the very beginning. That capacity is there, and it's set there in place. And that's why this text emphasizes that. Now, God would sometimes bless his people as they followed him with great abundance. At other times, he'd pull back on that because they turned to other gods and tried to find that promise of success elsewhere. And we're not very far from that when you think about it. Even today, what they thought of as food, well, we often presume food, though not all of us. Many people go to bed hungry at night, and there is much need for food in the world. But in addition to food, just in the lives of many of us, we have that, but we seek more, and we seek that, and so we worship our own gods and goddesses that we create and desire that, we're going to devote our time to earning money, to spending things in our careers and in our lives, rather than spending it with God, spending that one day in 7 that we talked about. What does that look like? Well, maybe that's something that we really need to think about, and maybe that's a good place here just to stop for today. And just may God bless us to see more clearly that, wow, we really need to worship God as creator.
Thank you.